Hello, my name is Henry Lim. I'm a dermatologist at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States. I'd like to thank Laroche-Posay for inviting me to participate in the workshop today. It is definitely a pleasure to work and speak with a number of my colleagues together on photodermatology and photoprotection. The topic of my part of presentation is on photodermatosis. As dermatologists, I'm sure you all are familiar with this, but I'd like to highlight specifically the impact of photodermatosis on the quality of life and on lifestyle, something that a lot of time we may not fully recognize. When we talk about photodermatosis, again, I think we know that we are referring to a heterogeneous group of skin disorders that is caused by or exacerbated by exposure to ultraviolet radiation and or visible light, essentially secondary to exposure to sunlight in general when we are outdoor. So when we talk about photodermatosis, traditionally, we divide it into several categories. Let me review for you the categories that we usually use, at least it's easier for us to think about how to manage this group of photodermatosis. We'll start with the one on the left here. This is what's called immunologically mediated, used to be called idiopathic photodermatosis. This includes the listing here. That is by far very, very common photodermatosis, the first one being polymorphous light eruption. Again, as dermatologists, I think I'm certain all of us had seen patients with polymorphous light. This occurs in otherwise healthy individuals. Approximately 10 to 15% of the general populations would have polymorphous light. Should be noted also, this tends to occur in the spring time, in a temperate climate, and tends to get better as the summer season progresses. The second one is actinic prurigo. It is not that common. Hydroa vacciniforme tend to occur more commonly in children, resulting in vacciniform scar, which is a pitted scar on the sun-exposed area. Solar urticaria, it is not that common, but probably many of you have seen this also, essentially the development of hives following exposure to sunlight. In contrast to polymorphous light, which would occur usually within 20 minutes to 30 minutes of sun exposure, sometimes it could be a few hours after sun exposure, solar urticaria almost occur immediately following sun exposure. In polymorphous light, the eruption would last for about 1 or 2 days before it goes away. Sometimes it could be about 4 or 5 days. In solar urticaria, it would disappear, would resolve usually within 24 hours. Another condition that we frequently see is chronic actinic dermatitis. As the name implies, this is a long-standing type of photoeruption, resulting in marked lichenification and pruritus on the sun-exposed area. It tends to occur more commonly in dark-skinned individuals, but clearly it can occur in all individuals with different skin types. The next group is so-called exogenous or endogenously induced photodermatosis. The exogenously induced usually is caused by drugs, by medications, either as a phototoxicity, usually through systemic agent, or photoallergy through usually contact allergy dermatitis, but associated with exposure to the sun. That's why it's called photoallergic reaction. For phototoxicity, exogenous photodermatosis, this tends to occur more commonly in older individual, mainly because as one gets older, the probability of taking medication that can cause exogenous photodermatosis would be higher. Endogenously induced photodermatosis, cutaneous porphyrias is the best example of it. Again, as dermatologists, we all remember from our training days that porphyrias is a group of diseases associated with a defect in the biochemical pathway of heme biosynthesis, usually caused by very specific enzymatic defect depending on the type of porphyria you are dealing with. In patients with cutaneous form of porphyria, clearly these patients are sensitive to sunlight, either resulting in the blister formation, like what you can see here in the skin fragility. As you can see here, this is patient with porphyria cutanea tarda, but there are other types of porphyria. All of them for cutaneous form are associated with varying degree of photosensitivity. The next two subgroups include defective in the DNA repair disorders. These are much less common, ranging from UV sensitive syndrome to Bloom syndrome, xeroderma pigmentosum, and cocaine syndrome. The one that we see not infrequently in the clinic setting, however, is the so-called photoaggravated dermatosis. This includes rosacea, psoriasis, acne vulgaris, and atopic dermatitis. Again, these are the more common ones, even though these are not primarily induced by sunlight, but we all know from clinical setting from our patients, not infrequently, these are conditions that can get worsen upon exposure to sunlight. That's why it's called photoaggravated dermatosis. So that in a very high level form, those are the four groups of photodermatosis that we can consider. Dealing with photodermatosis, obviously, we are dealing with exposure of sunlight resulting in development of skin eruption. I'd like to highlight that the action spectrum for photodermatosis is quite different. In actinic prurigo, polymorphous light eruption, photoaggravated dermatosis, the action spectrum is in the UVA as well as in the UVB range, some only UVA, some only UVB, but more frequently is combinations of these two. Should be noted that we know UVB penetrates to the upper part of the skin, while UVA being a longer wavelength, it penetrates deeper into the upper part of the dermis. Solar urticaria, on the other hand, is one of the few photodermatoses in which visible light can also be the action spectrum for this. Obviously, UVA and UVB in some patients could be also the action spectrum for solar urticaria. When you have the action spectrum in the visible light, that is when it is quite challenging because currently there are very few sunscreen available in the market that can help to protect against visible light. Moving on to chronic actinic dermatitis. This is the one that I've mentioned. It is a long-standing type eruption resulting in marked thickening of the skin, like canification on the sun-exposed area of the skin. Most commonly, the action spectrum is in the UVB range, but it also can be in the UVA range. Something that is unique for cutaneous porphyria is that the action spectrum is in the visible light range. I think we all know that, recall that porphyria is because of elevated level of porphyrins in the blood. And we also know that the action spectrum of porphyrin is in the SORAD band, which is from 400 to 410 nanometer. That's the reason that visible light is very important for the induction of cutaneous lesions in porphyrias. I'd like now to highlight some of the impact of quality of life of photodermatosis, something that, as I've mentioned, very frequently we don't think about in dealing with this group of individuals. This is a very nice study looking at 790 patients that had been followed in the clinic for approximately 5 years. They used a survey to ask these patients, how does it impact their quality of life? What they found is that in 2/3 of the patients with actinic prurigo impacted the quality of life very significantly. In 1/3 of the patients for the remaining photodermatosis, including polymorphous light eruption, solar urticaria, chronic actinic dermatitis, photoaggravated dermatosis, and a form of porphyria called erythropoietic protoporphyria, 1/3 of the patient also said that it would impact their quality of life. What are the impacts? Including inability to go out of the house, negative effect on holidays and trips, and I will mention that later on. Inability to sit out in the sun and to enjoy outdoor activities, obviously, and the need to cover up using clothing, which could be limiting for some patients. Now, this is another study looking at the impact on the lifestyle in terms of time being able to spend outdoor in the summertime or holidays that one can take every year. You could see that patients with photosensitive subject, as compared to healthy subjects in the summer weekdays, the ability to spend outdoor is significantly less compared to healthy subjects. And on weekends, also, there is a significant difference between the two groups. How about the ability to take holidays? You could see that on the upper part here, these are the summer holidays taken by healthy individuals and photosensitive patients. You could see that in terms of time period score here, that healthy individual can take significantly more holidays as compared to individuals with photosensitivity. In the summertime, but also even in the wintertime, there is still a difference between the ability of healthy individual to be able to take holidays as compared to patients with photosensitivity. Let's take a look at the impact of the lifestyle, specifically on occupation and behavioral impact. You could see that the inability to work outdoors or indoor under intense lighting is quite limiting in terms of choice of occupations. And then in terms of disease management and behavioral impacts, it does impact on the education, on performance and work, and of course on psychological health. This slide on the left here shows very clearly the impact. You could see that for the healthy patients compared to photosensitive patient, both of them are looking at the percent employed. You could see that 27% of the photosensitive patients were unemployed, as compared to healthy subjects, only 11% were unemployed. So that it significantly impact their employment and of course their livelihood because of that, both for full-time as well as for part-time employment. Let's look further in terms of the impact of lifestyle. This is specifically focusing on patients with polymorphous light eruption in terms of their psychological well-being. Essentially, they look at the anxiety. More 1/3 of the patients express they suffer from anxiety because of the condition. 38%, almost 39% suffer from depression, and greater than 40% mention that they have significant psychological distress because of the condition that they have, indicating that this is a condition that requires significantly better treatment, both in terms of medications, but also obviously in terms of photoprotection for this group of individuals. Having said that, again, speaking to a group of dermatologists, we also know that light not only is used for treatment of various diseases, it is part of the common practice as long as we can do it well. We all know that in terms of the phototherapy for the light for treatment, narrowband UVB by far is the most commonly used one now. Topical targeted phototherapy using excimer laser, long wave UVA, UVA1, and then PUVA, as well as photophoresis. All these are light-based treatment that we use mainly because UV light has major local and systemic immunosuppressive effect. Because of that, we have utilized it as a specialty to treat various diseases. Again, speaking to all of you, we are all very familiar with the condition that we commonly use phototherapy for, that would include psoriasis, atopic dermatitis, cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, as well as vitiligo. Clearly, there are many other conditions that I do not list here that light has been used as a treatment. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. I'd like now to turn this over to my colleague, an esteemed dermatologist and photodermatologist from Brazil, Professor Sergio Schalka. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Sergio Schalka. I'm a Brazilian dermatologist, and today we're going to talk about photodermatosis in different parts. You just have the great presentation of Professor Henry Lin, talking about photodermatoses in general. But now I'm gonna go deeply in different phototypes. So we know that the profile and risk of actinic damage depends on many ambiental factors, such as geographic locations, professional activities, lifestyle, and mainly depending on skin phototype. Lighter skin, we know, are more prone to have sunburn, DNA damage, photoaging, and especially skin cancer. On the opposite way, darker skin are more prone to have pigmentation, melasma, and post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation. But what I'm going to discuss right now is that photodermatoses are also influenced by different phototypes. And this is a very nice paper presented by the group of Professor Lin in Detroit in 2014. In this study, the authors evaluate the frequency of different photodermatoses comparing African Americans, so darker skin, to Caucasians, so lighter skin. What they found? They found, first one, polymorphous light eruption is more prevalent in darker skin than in Caucasians. On the other way, phototoxic derm eruption and porphyrias are more prevalent in lighter skin. And all the other photodermatoses have the same prevalence between darker and lighter skin. So we can understand that there's differences between photodermatoses in darker and lighter skin, but not for all diseases. This is another study published by a group of India. In this study, the authors evaluate the spectrum of photodermatoses in phototypes 4 and 5. And they found that polymorphous light eruption and chronic actinic dermatitis, both of these diseases represent 75% of all photodermatoses in darker skin. So these two diseases is the more important if we're talking about photodermatoses and darker skin. And this is a very interesting paper published last year. The authors evaluate the minimal erythematous dose for UVB and UVA in different phototypes and in patients with and without photodermatoses to see if there's a difference between the erythematous response in patients with disease and without disease, and how they have this representation in different phototypes. What they found first, the MED of UVB is correlated with the skin type and increased in higher phototypes. Of course, this was expected, but they didn't find this correlation in UVA. So the effect of UVA is the same in different phototypes. The MED UVB was not influenced by the presence of photodermatoses. So the MED of UVB in patients and people without photodermatoses are equally the same. But when it go into UVA, then is a difference. The UVA was reduced, so people are more sensible in patients with photodermatoses compared to patients without photodermatoses. So at the end, UVA seems to have a higher influence than expected in the pathogenesis of photodermatoses, and proportionally, UVA is more relevant in the photodermatoses affecting darker skin than lighter skin. And going further and discussion the photoprotection in photodermatoses, and this comes from this paper our group published last year, showing that the use of high SPF and high UVA protection factor is relevant in the treatment and prevention of photodermatoses. And in the same paper, we discussed that the impact of UVA is greater in darker skin patients compared to lighter skin ones. So the need of high UVA protection sunscreens are even more relevant in patients with darker skin. So in conclusion, all skin types are affected by photodermatoses. High SPF and high UVA protection, so SPF UVA protection factor ratio close to 1, is a need for all patients with photodermatosis, but especially for darker skin. Thank you very much. And now we're gonna have a great presentation of Professor Martin Rosso, who's talking about the revolution in UVA protection. Thank you.
After these eminent dermatologists explain to us how important is a good photoprotection for patients with photodermatosis, it is my great pleasure to introduce UV Immune 400, Laroche-Posay's new weapon for an even better photoprotection. Formulators have at their disposal different UV filters, which they combine to create the most efficient filtering system possible. But if you look at this slide, you will see that on the right, there are no UV filters able to block the UVs from 380 to 400 nanometer, the ultra-long UVAs. So at L'Oréal, we started wondering whether it would be useful to have such a UV filter to complete the filtering system efficacy. But does it really matter to block this narrow UV band? You probably know that UVAs, in particular UVA1, constitute most of the UV reaching the Earth. But if you concentrate on this 20 nanometer band, you see that by themselves, they constitute 30% of the total UV reaching the Earth. And moreover, these UVs are the most penetrating of them all, going deep inside the dermis. In fact, we can really consider them as the most insidious UV rays because they leave no immediate harmful clinical signs, but they penetrate very deeply into the skin and are very numerous. As you very well know, the clinical consequences of sun exposure are many, as summarized in this slide. It is interesting to see that UVA is involved in almost all cases, including, of course, photodermatosis. So it's obvious that choosing a sunscreen only on the basis of its SPF will not provide the most efficient protection. And completing the UV coverage by blocking the 30% of UVs not covered by existing sunscreen can be expected to have a significant clinical impact. So L'Oréal took the decision to develop a new UV filter. And after 10 years of research, hundreds of different trials, we're proud to present Mexolane 400, a new UV filter able for the first time to block efficiently the 20 nanometer gap from 380 to 400 nanometer, hence the name Mexolane 400. This is Mexolane 400, the last frontier in UV protection. The inky name is sometimes abbreviated as MCE, which we use in our scientific publications. You can see on the bottom left the absorption spectrum of this filter in red, which is very strong and blocks very efficiently this narrow band representing 30% of UV not covered until now. And by combining Mexolane 400 with other existing filters, you can see in the middle that one can really broaden the filtering system of a sunscreen and provide, for the first time, a very efficient protection throughout the UV range. This filter has already been approved in Europe, in Hispanic Latin America, and in Southeast Asia. Its approval is pending in Brazil and other countries. It has an impeccable safety profile, no risk of endocrine modulation, no risk of bioaccumulation, and no environmental labeling. It was co-developed by L'Oréal Research and Innovation and BASF. But before deciding to include it in our commercialized product, we wanted to be absolutely convinced that it would bring something significant to the level of protection of sunscreens in practice. So in order to do that, we compared a classical sunscreen with a sunscreen enriched in Mexolane 400 to really be able to see the added value of this specific filter on the level of protection. In this slide, we looked at the number of fibroblasts remaining after exposure to UVA1 in reconstructed skin. With that product, as you can see on the right, the number of fibroblasts decreases dramatically, even with a relatively low UVA dose. With the classical formula in red, you can mitigate this effect and keep more fibroblasts alive. But if you add MixOA 400, then the level of protection increases significantly. With the highest level, you see almost no decrease in the number of fibroblasts, even after 80 joules of UVA1, something which was not possible to achieve until now. Moving forward, we tested the benefit in vivo, looking at pigmentation, comparing two SPF 30 formulas, one with MixOA 400 and the other one without, versus vehicle. Obviously, the vehicle in gray does not prevent a significant level of pigmentation upon exposure to UVA1. Some protection is achieved with the reference formula in red, but with the formula containing MixOA in blue, you get a very significant increase in the level of protection. Indeed, looking at the pictures on the bottom left, the formula containing MixOA 400 prevents almost all of the pigmentation induced by UVA1 exposure in vivo. The last study I want to show you today was done on finished products SPF 50+. We tested a fluid SPF 50+ with MixOA 400 and compared it to the best formula we could find on the market in terms of UVA protection. The skin was exposed to 7 daily doses of full spectrum UV, both UVB and UVA, representative of real-life exposure. And as you can see, either by ITA or visual scoring, the performance of the product with 1% MixOA 400 was significantly better than the best performing formula on the market today. When you come to think of it, it's not very surprising, because even this high protection classical formula will not block 30% of total UV. So by getting this extra protection with MixOA 400, one can expect a very significant improvement in the level of protection. Having proven the increase of UVA protection brought by MixOA 400, we introduced it in our Anthelios pillar, the face hydrating cream and the invisible fluid, for a launch next year under UV-Mune 400. For the first time on the market, thanks to MixOA 400, the new UV-Mune formulas cover efficiently the entire UV spectrum all the way to 400 nanometer. The rest of the filtering system includes, as before, very powerful UV filters, non-controversial, with an impeccable safety and environmental profile. The tinted versions provide additional protection in the visible range measured in vivo. Superior clinical performance of the UV-Mune 400 formulas was assessed with 2 UV doses versus a non-treated zone and a reference sunscreen. Even after an exposure of 40 joules, no alteration of the skin was observed regarding the granular layers, the number of fibroblasts, or any appearance of sunburn cells, markers of photoaging, pigmentation, loss of skin elasticity, or sagginess. Contrary to the non-treated zone, or even with the reference sunscreen, the skin protected by the UV-Mune 400 formula presented no mutation or DNA lesion after an exposure of 40 joules, predicting good prevention of UV-induced carcinogenesis. And of course, the UV-Mune 400 formulas keep all of the attributes you have come to rely upon with Anthelios: respect of marine life, ultra-resistance, no eye stinging, an ultralight, non-greasy, and invisible texture even on melanin-rich skin. And last but not least, as I'm sure you have understood by now, ultimate UVB and UVA protection now extended all the way to 400 nanometers. Thank you very much for your attention.